Conflict. When I think of conflict in the context of leadership and of church leadership, which is the only real leadership I've ever known, I can almost hear most leaders, and probably you, saying, no, thank you. In fact, it reminds me of one of the books that we used when our kids were little for their bedtime stories. It's a famous kids' storybook called We're Going on a Bear Hunt. And some of the parents in the room will automatically recognise it. And the characters in the story, which are a family, a mum, a dad, and a number of kids and a dog, are going on this kind of mystical or mythical bear hunt, which is something you should never take your kids hunting down bears, but there you go. And with every obstacle they face, they end up almost chanting these words: we can't go over it, we can't go under it, oh no, we've got to go through it. And I think sometimes that's the way that many leaders think about conflict, and understandably so. And it got me thinking about whether that's the way in which the children of Israel thought when they crossed the Jordan and they were all excited about walking into the land that was going to be flowing with milk and honey, the land of promise, and there in front of them is Jericho. And God says to them, you're going to walk around it for 6 days, and then I'm taking you through it, right down the high street, because their progress towards their promise necessarily involved conflict. In fact, if you read the story of the way in which the children of Israel, through those books of the Old Testament, take upon themselves their promise, it is constantly wars and battles. It is through challenge and conflict, and learning to do it God's way, and learning how to do it, because Jericho, they followed God's instruction, they walked down the high street, but they really messed up AI because they didn't do it the way God wanted them to do it. And what I want to try to show you today is just one particular aspect, not to talk too broadly about the realm of conflict, but to suggest to you that not all conflict is a bad thing. So that in these early stages of leadership, or for those of us in the room who are more seasoned, to understand that sometimes conflict is a good and a necessary thing. Because churches in general do conflict badly. Here's a quote that I picked up during my recent research by Hugh Haverstad, who says that Christians fight, they also fight dirty. Issues are personalised. Gossip and hearsay fog up reason and common sense. Enemy-making wounds shred long-standing friendship. It's no wonder that so many thoughtful Christians avoid church conflicts like the plagues of Egypt. Now, conflict, folks, is inevitable. And so it's good to decide early on how we're going to respond to it, how we're going to learn to handle it. Because if you don't want to face conflict, then Chris and I might need to accept your resignation letter now. Because I can categorically tell you, you will not progress as a leader, and you will not achieve your potential without conflict at some level or other. In a moment or two, I'm going to talk about some levels of conflict. But I want to start by considering for a moment some causes of conflict. Now, I did quite a lot of reading around this, and there's so many different ways of looking at it. And one of the difficulties is that conflict is complex and can't always easily be defined in one root cause. But one model I found quite helpful that summarised some of it is known as Mayer's Wheel of Conflict. And it's by a guy called Bernard Mayer in his book, The Dynamics of Conflict Resolution, not a Christian book. Quite a few of the books I looked at were from management, etc. And I will post these slides as a PDF on the Facebook page a little later. And he identifies, as you can see, 5 particular categories that are causes of conflict, and they all rotate around human need. That most conflict stems from some sense of human need. And he believes that conflict doesn't exist in a vacuum, but is embedded in what he calls a constellation of other forces or conflicts. In other words, there are other things at play in and around conflict that if we don't understand them and we can't identify them, we will get sucked into the conflict and not the causes and the root issues, which are where we need to see to be able to progress through. So I'm just going to talk about these briefly, focus a little bit more on the final one before we move on. So he talks about communication is a cause of conflict. Humans are imperfect communicators, and that imperfection can generate conflict. Most of us work on the assumption that we're being understood. And it is the assumption that we're being understood that can be a root cause of the problem. Because if we don't work hard enough at making what we're communicating clear, then people often get into conflict, not because you've done anything wrong, but because they don't understand what you're actually trying to communicate. And Tim touched on communication yesterday. Individuals can find it hard to communicate about complex matters, particularly when there are emotionally difficult circumstances surrounding it. And church has this unique capacity, the body of Christ, to involve emotion in pretty much everything that we are and everything we do. It's part of what makes conflict in church settings unique to corporate settings, where emotions rarely come into it, because it's the cut and thrust of being employed, having contracts, having job descriptions, doing what you're told. If not, by, you're out of the picture. So communication is a problem, but also emotions, because emotions are the energy that fuel conflict. Disappointment, sadness, bitterness, rage, offense, all kinds of emotions can fuel conflict. Because it's not actually human to stay calm when our beliefs or our values or our actions are being questioned. And often, one of the causes of conflict is the inability to really handle the emotions we're feeling. And so some situations should not actually cause conflict, but they cause conflict because of the way I feel about it, or somebody else feels about it, etc. But also values can be a cause of conflict. Values are the beliefs that we have that are really important to us. They're formed in our lives through years, through our experiences, through our influences, through what has educated us, what has taught us, what's impressed us, what's inspired us, what infuses us. And value systems can equally be complex. And when there is a clash of values, conflict can exist. Because when people believe that their values are under attack, they often feel that they are being attacked as a person. So it's hard sometimes to actually divide away the fact that actually this is about this principle, this value, this thing, not about us, me and you. And that is the great challenge in Christian leadership, to be able to deal with conflict moments in a less personal way. But another area that Mayer suggests are structures. The way things are decided, the way things are done, how a decision is made, and the actions that followed it are all factors often in conflict. So people can sometimes agree with what needs to be done, but they can be in conflict about how it's actually done. The decisions, the processes, the timing, the way things were done are not the way they anticipated. What we agreed needed to be done is carried out. And those structures can be a point of conflict. But this next one, I wanted to spend just a few more moments on, because it is, I think, quite unique to church environments, and that's history. And I've got a slide to identify what I think are three particular issues in this cause of conflict in relation to church life in terms of history, historic influences, generational tensions. The first area I think that this can be a cause of conflict for us is around tradition. You know, the worship wars or the stylistic battles we have in church life when church progresses. And in real terms, however long you've been in church, I have been in an Elim church all my life. For my first 21 years as a local church member, as a Bible college student, and since the age of 21 as a local church leader. So pretty much all my life as a local church leader, certainly a majority. This is a massive issue. And I want to suggest to you that the fact we're in the 21st century, in a movement that has changed a lot, doesn't mean that our churches don't experience problems with tradition. Traditions don't only relate to what we did 50 years ago, they can relate to what we did 50 weeks ago. Here's a little bit, it may be prophetic, it might just be my perspective. When we get back to church after lockdown, people are going to struggle with the fact that we're not doing what we did a year ago. That's tradition, that's custom, that's practice. And those issues can create in our churches conflict, but also what I've called entitlement. The expectation of privilege by some who have been in the church for many years, maybe significant financial donors, maybe their church, their family have been significant in the church for many years. And it brings often with it a sense of entitlement that, we should, that people don't articulate it like that. But when decisions are made, when things are being done, why weren't we consulted? Why weren't what we wanted? There's this major problem in the church that we want to see lost people won for Jesus. But sometimes when we're building church, we come up against people who think that things should be the way they want them. And they're a real challenge sometimes to alter and to change people's philosophy and mindset about church. And this sense of entitlement can sit there in people and cause conflict. But here's another issue, and that's buried disputes. Let me illustrate what I mean. During the Great War, the First World War, the 1914 to 1918 war, British and German forces launched more than 1 billion, not a million, 1 billion shells and bombs at each other as they fought in vain to break the stalemate in the mud of what was known as the Western Front in kind of southern Belgium and northern France. Those lethal shells killed millions of people on both sides during the First World War, but they continue to kill people today. Do you know that over 100 years since that conflict ended, an estimated 300 million unexploded bombs lie buried underneath farmland in northern France and southern Belgium? The Belgians call something that happens every year the Iron Harvest. And every year, a team of expert bomb disposal officers who are permanently stationed in this red zone where people cannot actually go, enter and remove up to hundreds of tons of unexploded munitions. You see just in that picture on the side, an example. These were all part of what's called the Iron Harvest. These were unexploded munitions that date back over 100 years now that lie unexploded. People have stepped inadvertently on them. Farmers have come across them, lost limbs, lost their lives. And in particular parts of that northern front, you cannot actually go. It's called the red zone. I want to suggest to you that there are sometimes issues that sit in the culture of our churches, buried underneath the surface, that you walk in as the new leader, the new assistant pastor, youth pastor, whatever, and you just deal with the situation, and all of a sudden there's an explosion. You think, my goodness me, where did that come from? Because unfortunately, things were not dealt with. Conflicts weren't resolved, and tensions existed that sit under the surface of many a church situation. We need to move on, but there are just some of the causes of conflict that I've certainly identified both practically in ministry, but also in recent study. But I want to talk for a moment about levels of conflict, because conflict takes a variety of forms and can be understood by a means of an escalating scale of intensity and impact. One writer called Speed Lees, yes, that's his name, Speed as in speed and Lees as in Leas, in a book called Mastering Conflict and Controversy, has identified 5 levels of conflict. And so I thought what I could do was apply a very well-known scale for measuring intensity. Some of you will know this really well. In fact, Josh Daniel will know this well because I've sat with him as he's seen this. It's called the periometer. And if you're a fan of Nando's and you visited Nando's, then you've seen the periometer, where you can choose the intensity of the spice and the heat in the food that you want. I call this little diagram the conflict periometer, to help illustrate that there are different levels of conflict. For example, level 1 are predicaments. This is what Speed Lee suggests. Level 1 are predicaments. They are unpleasant difficulties, but they're mild. They're just little problems we have to solve. They're not particularly big. They actually form a part of your life as a leader, most weeks, if not most months. Just predicaments that come along, but they can actually be a cause of conflict. The next level are disagreements. Here, there is probably beginning to be stronger sense of difference of opinion, but they can still be relatively mild, not extra mild, but they can be mild. People start taking different views on things, and these disagreements can occur. If we're not careful, those will turn into contests, which are medium heat on the conflict periometer. And here, winning and coming out on top becomes part of the whole nature of the conflict. The original problem actually begins to get lost in more aggressive tones and more personal accusations. It becomes a slightly more intense situation where people are battling with one another over the whole situation. Unfortunately, and certainly I know the GS and I have seen this in all levels of our leadership, we then can discover fights happen. And we're finding these become much hotter in the intensity of conflict. Hostilities are much more obvious. They're no longer just under the surface or in leadership settings or one-to-ones or small groups. They actually become more obvious. And combatants aim verbal and emotional punches that are designed to hurt one another. This is officially a hot situation and becomes very difficult to handle. But the final level that Speedley suggests are wars. We've reached extra hot levels here in our conflict periometer. And actually, this is when it breaks out into press releases and all kinds of objectionable behaviour that circulate around a church situation. Alistair Mackay, in a pamphlet written called How Does the Church Handle Conflict, says that this level is perhaps better referred to as holy war, since the conflict is out of the participants' control and the goal of opposing parties is to destroy one another. Hey, we're in a meeting here, all of Christian leaders. The huge sadness is that this does happen in Christian world. Does happen. It's not just that churches split, but acrimoniously, awfully, and people are damaged and hurt and distanced. And like all scales of escalation, the key, if I could go back to the previous slide, the key is to try to deal with the conflicts as low down in this periometer as is possible. The more we allow the conflict to move through its levels, the more difficult it becomes to solve. So let's flip the whole discussion now into healthy conflict. Healthy conflict, you say? Surely that is an oxymoron. Well, I want to suggest to you, not necessarily. Listen to what James Schellenberg in his book Conflict Resolution says. He says, conflict is so fully a part of all forms of society that we should appreciate its importance for stimulating new thoughts, for promoting social change, for defining our group relationships, for helping us from our own sense of personal identity, form our own sense of personal identity, and for many other things we take for granted in our everyday lives. We have seen some conflicts socially over recent months that we hope will bring about significant social change when it comes to racial justice and social justice at all levels. Do you know, there are 1,189 chapters in the Bible, and only 4 of those chapters have no effects of conflict within them. Just pause to see if you can figure out what 4 chapters in the Bible have no sense of conflict as part of their narrative. Well, actually, it's the first 2 and the last 2. Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 20 and 21 are the only chapters in the Bible where conflict is not part of the human experience. From the fall to the establishment of the eternal kingdom to come, conflict is part of the story of humanity. Disagreement, though, does not have to lead to war. It can lead to progress. Some leaders struggle with any form of critical perception from our performance. We don't like criticism. I remember years ago reading a little book by Jamie Buckingham called Coping with Criticism. And the thing that really struck me was he said that the biggest problem for most leaders is that they aren't prepared to discover that in all forms of criticism, there is some truth. And sometimes that's the problem. You see, critical, the word critical does not have to mean finding fault or judging severely. It can mean skillful judgment, or in an academic sense, which I had to learn over the last 3 years, it's about textual analysis. I had to critique certain documents, certain books, not the person, but the thoughts and the opinions. See, honest analysis is vital to building a healthy and fruitful church. And a leader who is insulated from honest analysis is invariably in an unhealthy position. If you are a leader that nobody can ever comment on, criticize on, or suggest that you may not have it right without going to war with them, you are not in a healthy position. Conflict does not have to always mean war. It can be the point at which we begin to discover that things aren't exactly as we thought that they were. Now, there's a guy called Patrick Lencioni who wrote a great book, some of you will know, called The Advantage. And he illustrates this point in this diagram, which he calls the conflict continuum. And you'll see this diagram has two opposing ends. The end on the left, as you look at it, is artificial harmony, and the other end is mean-spirited personal attack. And this is the continuum he suggests that conflict exists in. And he says that there is a demarcation line in the middle where constructive conflict actually turns into destructive conflict. But let me just make a few comments here. You see, artificial harmony is as damaging sometimes as mean-spirited personal attacks. Because if all we have on our leadership teams in our church is the bless you, my brother, the Lord bless you, the smile and the nod, with nobody ever really being honest that they think we've got a problem, they think there's something for us to deal with, a solution we need to find, and we never actually honestly talk as leaders and say, we've got a problem, and we just cover it all over. All we're doing is burying a mine for a future conflict. We're putting it, we're suppressing it, we're burying it, and I can guarantee you something in the future will spark off a conversation, and that will go off, an explosion will go off. Now, we don't want mean-spirited attacks. What Patrick Lencioni suggests is that somehow we need constructive criticism, constructive conflict, built around honesty, that we can actually go almost to the point of slipping over into destructive conflict, but we can deal with things without feeling personally threatened about everything. Challenging issues appropriately, addressing attitudes correctly, identifying failings positively are all parts of healthy conflict that harness our capacity to progress. Honest critical analysis may be uncomfortable, but it can improve decision making. It can stimulate creativity. It can encourage interest. It can measure progress. And if you want to move your ministry, your church forward, you will experience friction. And actually, friction is part of life. If I want to go out today in my car, which is on the drive over my shoulder here, I will need friction to progress. My tyre will have to gain friction with the road, and my tyre can only do that because of elements of friction in the engine. The issue with friction is it's part of all of our walks in life. We create friction when we walk. What you have to do with friction is control the heat. And to the extent that you can control the heat, you can progress. When the heat is out of control, then it becomes destructive. And so there is a sense in which conflict can be a positive thing. It can enable you to move forward when you're willing to challenge things appropriately, address things correctly, identify problems positively. You can begin to move things forward. Some conversations have to be had. But if you do them right, and I'm going to suggest a model in this last part of what I want to share with you today, then you can progress. So what I want to do now is talk really about a positive approach to conflict. How do we maintain that? What might that look like? And the points I want to offer you are the beginning of an approach to conflict that can acknowledge the inevitability of conflict because it is part of what happens, but also try to address how we do that in order to ensure that we, to the best of our ability, are leading forward in conflict. So let me just suggest a number of things to you. The first is build relationship and trust. Anybody who's ever worked with me, and there's a couple in the room, will know that I would suggest the most critical relationship a church leader has or a ministry leader has are with your team. Most conflicts will start in team situations. Most conflicts that damage church life will start in team situations. When trust is broken down, it's a slippery slope in terms of conflict. And we have to build a bond in the stronger times to enable us to survive the weaker times. The bond that we build relationally with the women and the men on our leadership teams will enable us to endure the bad times. Years ago, a preacher came to our conference, and I remember him telling a story about how he had to understand in terms of relationships that it's a little bit like using a cash point. On one occasion, he got home and he forgot that his wife had asked him to pick up something from the shop and a birthday card for her mother's birthday so she could send it. And when she said, "Did you remember that?" He said, "No, I didn't." And she absolutely exploded. And he stood there in this explosion thinking, what on earth is this about? What's going on here? I just forgot to get something from the shop. I forgot the card. I can pop out and do it. And he realized what had happened was a little bit like his visits to the cash point. He'd been making so many withdrawals in the relationship without making any deposits that all of a sudden the account said, no further funds available. If all you do as a leader is constantly demand of people, withdraw from people, take from people, require of people, ask of people, without depositing into them encouragement, support, help, prayer, how you're doing, I'm with you all the way, that you did great there, you will find a point where suddenly in that relationship, they'll be saying, no more funds available. And the issue will not be the issue, it will be the breakdown in your relationship. And too many leaders ask and ask and ask and ask and ask and ask without some giving, supporting. And the extent to which you build those relationships, it will enable you to survive the tough times. Trust takes time to build. Someone once said that trust is a little bit more like a light switch, a bit more like a thermometer. It takes time to build up, but it's easy just to turn off. You know, it's like a light switch. You can just switch off trust instantly. It takes ages to build it up, but bam, all of a sudden it can be gone. And when trust is gone, conflict happens. So in building a positive approach to conflict, it starts with a bedrock of trust and relationship that you build over time. So if you're going into a new leadership situation, here's my number one bit of advice to you. Don't ask too much of your leaders in the first year. Spend a huge amount of time building relationship, because you'll get exponentially more back when you have relationship that you've built that foundation of relationship. They know you care about them. They know you support them. They know you're with them. Then they will begin to trust you. Here's another one, might be a bit more difficult. Encourage healthy disagreement. Respect people's different opinions and work with them. Open the doorway for honest comment. It's what Patrick Lencioni would call mining for conflict. In other words, have you ever in your leadership team meetings recognized that somebody is not really actually being honest, and you've stopped the meeting and said, do you know what? This would be a really good opportunity. I really sense that this, we really need to be honest here. I'm comfortable. You need to say it. We need to air it. Have you gone mining for the difficult issues? Or pause the discussion and determined as a leader, we're not going to make a decision on this because actually we're sensing there's a degree of disagreement in the room. Let's talk about that. Let's air that. Let's get that out into the open. I value your opinion, because if you're the kind of leader that cannot take people going with you 100% of the time on everything you've decided, everything you want to do, you're going to have difficulty. I can tell you now, after 33 years of experience, I never got everything I ever wanted through an eldership meeting. There were some times I pulled back. Sometimes I said, we're not going to talk any more about it. Let's just take it away now. Let's pray over this next month. And I actually then went to visit a few of the guys to say, look, I know you're struggling with this. Let's talk about it. We have to encourage it. We have to deal with our insecurities. Otherwise, they will be exposed in the heat of disagreement. The leader's insecurities. I would suggest that we need to hold our tongue and our temper, because if you lose them, you lose people. The moment we lose our temper and lose our tongue, we've often lost people. And actually, the reality is, without diversity, you haven't got a team. If you want a real team, you're going to have diversity in it and take the rough with the smooth. But if you want to positively deal with conflict, I think what we have to do sometimes is encourage people to be honest and open about what they're feeling and encourage healthy disagreement. The third thing, and there's 5 of these, I want to suggest is to look for early warning signs. Approaching conflict in a positive way will sometimes mean being proactive. If we ignore or avoid any sign of conflict, we will find it will hinder our ability to respond when some situations are at the early stages of development. One of the things I learned as I had to learn on the ground, really, because in those days there was no training really for how you lead a team. But as I was building teams, we were building team in CLC over the years. I made some mistakes along the way with my staff team and with my MITs. And one of the mistakes I made was I overlooked little things. And eventually they just developed into much bigger issues. And I remember having to sit down with a couple of my MITs, and we had a right humdinger we didn't need to have, because I had not just early enough gone and sat in their office with a cup of coffee, say, can I just chat about this? Just need a little chat. I think it's something, I'm just not sure where we're at with this. I'm a bit concerned about that. I gave a little too much room on things because I didn't want any hassle today. I don't want any more this week. And actually they mount up, and I wasn't looking at the early warning signs and responding then. Good leadership involves necessary observational skills to identify the signs of an approaching conflict. If you brush it under the carpet, someone's going to lift the lid on lift the corner of the carpet at some point. And learning to deal with things, the early warning signs, being the leader, taking the lead, sitting down with the person, saying, hey, let's talk about this, will be very, very important in the process. In fact, I haven't put this on the slides, but I'm happy for anybody who wants my notes to have them. But Peter Scazzaro has highlighted a number of signs to look out for. He suggests things like withdrawal from meetings. Is somebody regularly not turning up to meetings with no excuse, no reason? Unannounced absences. Erratic or unusual behaviour. This is not the way this person normally behaves. Sharp or impolite emails. There's a whole lesson there on how we handle emails, but are some emails, some comments on WhatsApp groups and all those other interactive things, are they a bit sharp? Are they a bit impolite? Unusually negative comments or feedback. This isn't something this person is usually negative about. What about emotional reactions that seem unusual? Angry outbursts, or even you notice little groups chatting. You notice people have been chatting in little groups. Those may be some of the signs, early warning signs. A couple more of these to cover, beginning to wrap up. Fourth positive approach to conflict is to establish the rules of engagement. Almost all churches have a culture for how they respond to conflict. And if they haven't set in place how we're going to do it, it just defaults to how they've always done it. And this is usually the combination of the traditions, the attitudes, the behaviours, the habits that shape the way they've usually responded to different situations. So some churches, we just don't talk about it and we get on with things. We're just burying a dispute. Some churches, we just go at it like crazy. Some leadership teams, they just don't know how to handle it. I want to suggest to you that you need to know how to handle disputes. In my earliest years at CLC, I came into a church situation that had known a lot of conflict, and it hadn't been handled particularly well over the years. In one of the early elders meetings, there was a dispute happening. It was simply over whether or not we should have some railings attached to some walls around a building we owned. And one guy felt so strongly about it, and the other guys felt it would just make the building look like an institution that wasn't welcoming. And I could see this guy was on the edge of his seat. And I thought, he's going to storm out the meeting. He's going to walk out in a minute. And I said to him, I won't say his name, but I said to him, please don't walk out the meeting. That's not the way to deal with it. And I could see him, and this was getting more heated. And all of a sudden, he's up and away. And as he goes out the door, I said to him, I'd like to see you tomorrow. I was 29 years old. He was in his 60s. He came to my office, and I knew if I didn't say, this is not the way we do things around here. This is not how we handle conflict. And I gave him a little bit of a speech, and he looked at me and he said, I feel like you're talking to me like I'm a child. And just in one of those moments of inspiration that probably wasn't me, I said, well, if you behave like a child, I'll talk to you like a child. When you behave like an adult, I'll talk to you like an adult. And he went quiet. And he just burst into laughter. Thought it was hilarious. And we had a chat about that. And I said to him, we have to build a different way of doing conflict. And over the years, we were able to begin to do that. Here's just a few suggestions about, how you can establish that. You can maybe say to your team, there's going to be no personal attacks. We don't do personal attacks in our meeting. That is not the way we do it. No talking about people behind their backs. If you are a leader and you have an issue, something, then you have to be able, as a leader, to go to that person and talk to them about it. No aggressive physical gestures, all of that kind of stuff. No refusal to talk or engage with each other. I'm not talking about it. No, actually, we don't do that. If you want to be a leader, then we talk about these things. We deal with them. No name calling. And maybe just a little thing I've slipped into, I must admit over the years, because it's a bit my personality. Always be careful of how people use humour. Sometimes humour can be targeted. It's not humour, it's making a point. And I've seen that over the years. Let's not forget that in Matthew 18, 15 to 17, Jesus sets out the rules of engagement for how we deal with personal conflict. It's there for you to see. A guy called Ken Sande, who's a writer on these things, suggests, say to your team, listen, we may have a falling out someday. If that happens, what are we going to do? Failure to have accountability structures in place before a conflict is the single most frequent issue we deal with in conflicts between leaders, pastors, elders, deacons, and people at every level. Final point, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. Respond appropriately and proportionately. Do you know the difference between a reaction and a response is about 48 hours. If we react, then normally that just adds fuel to the fire. If we take time to think, to pray, to reflect, to calm down, we're often more able to respond. Let's not forget that the church is called to be a redemptive community. And being redemptive is a contrast to being passive, evasive, defensive, or aggressive. It requires a total commitment to transformation under the lordship of Christ. Being redemptive is not just saying there. It's dealing with a situation, teaching people. We have to disciple our leaders as much as we disciple ourselves and our people. We have to teach leaders how to lead, how to deal with situations, that this is the way we're going to deal with it. Bit of advice from Paul to Timothy in 2 Timothy 4 verse 5. Keep your head in all situations. That's the key to leading through conflict. Keep your head. Little maxim of mine, the greatest leaders are not those who shout the loudest, but those who think the clearest. So whilst you would rather avoid any kind of conflict, there is enormous opportunity sometimes to progress. You will not move something forward without addressing issues, but how you choose to do it, the way you're going to do it, the positive approach you take needs to be established. Some of these guidelines might help you. It may be that a key antidote to destructive conflict is actually the use of positive conflict, seeing things early, dealing with things early, establishing guidelines. When healthy conflict is part of the culture of a local church, it is entirely possible that people can grow and flourish together in an environment of truth and respect. Thanks, everybody.